So it was interesting. I actually woke up this morning to a report from IQVIA. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's a big international CRO, and they have done a report recently. They scanned, I think, 6 countries aside from the US, and looked at this very question of what was CAR T penetration looking like in those countries, and what were some of the various challenges and successes that they had unique to their. So I think it was Germany, Australia, Canada, the UK, and 1 or 2 others. I'll circulate that around. It was some interesting sort of at least very high level takeaways, but also just pointed out the regional disparities between what it looks like in different countries, depending obviously on the different infrastructure, different reimbursement, different hospital systems that were available in those countries. So there's definitely a regional flavor to this.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the US, obviously, the biggest news of, I think, on the eve of this call has been the elimination of REMS. And I think the impact of that will take some time. But I think generally the sense is that opens, that's a big door to opening community hospital access to being able to deliver these therapies in a way that
it's
they
a
were
positive
restricted,
indication of what the regulatory agencies are moving for. It's a signal.
Mm-hmm. And let's face it, those programs are very expensive for pharma. People don't understand that does end up in that per patient cost. It just simply does.
And the timeline.
I think the other aspect of that, separate from the REMS, is the reduction in what we call the proximity requirement. So this is a big barrier for patients in the community,
right?
Where they have to travel, let's say to an academic center that delivers these therapies and stay in close proximity along with a caregiver. So some people just can't afford to do that. They can't afford to not work for that long, or their jobs won't allow it, or other life considerations prevent them from doing that. And in addition to elimination of the REMS, that requirement for 6 of the commercial products has now been reduced from 28 days to 14 days based on real world data.
Nice.
So that's makes it hopefully much less onerous for some of these patients, and we can expect more uptake based on that, I think, and also a reduction in the driving limitations from 8 weeks, I think, down to I don't remember if it's 2 or 4 weeks, but that's also significant, we think. And this is something that we at ARM and others have been advocating for a while, and I think also, Audrey, to the point about this being a positive signal from the agency.
Yeah.
Another specific aspect of it is that they are taking into consideration real world data in making these decisions. And it wasn't as if these companies had to go out and do like a separate clinical study to get the labeling change.
Wonderful.
What do we call that reduction in the time where you have to stay close to the hospital? Mike, is there
we call it a proximity requirement. I don't know who coined that term.
Yeah, no, that's a nice real way to put it. And a naive question, does the REMS apply only to post-infusion sort of care, or does it also apply to like lymphodepletion, or is that kind of a non-issue?
My understanding is it's a non-issue. I think the REMS really kicks in. It's related to the product, not to the lymphodepletion prior to that. Right. That's my understanding. And REMS has multiple sort of components to it, right? It has an education component, as Mike mentioned. It's got a proximity component. Now, the FDA did sort of specify, right, the 15-year monitoring for secondary malignancies, that still stays. That was never part of REMS. So I think people need to differentiate those two. So that's more of a data monitoring burden that's on the treatment center.
Yeah.
Georgie, should we get started? What are we looking like?
Yeah, let's go. Please, kick us off, Lee.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for being here. For those of you who are in America, I'm doing so on the eve of your national celebration. So I'm very, very happy to have everyone here. Most importantly, happy to be kicking off Advanced Therapies Think Tank in its truest virtual manifestation. So we have created Advanced Therapies Think Tank to create conversations between experts focused on solutions to some of the biggest challenges we're facing in advanced therapies, and create specific calls to actions and propose solutions to those challenges. We're going to spend very little time level setting around the problem. We assume you're educated on the topic, experienced in the sector, and have a good sense of the challenges we're facing. We're going to focus really on solutions. What solutions are we pursuing today? What could we be doing differently? And also, which organizations do we think are best suited to lead those? So structurally, the founders of Advanced Therapies Think Tank are myself, Sven Keeley, and Michelle Boxall. The hosts are myself, Sven Keeley, and today's host, Audrey Greenberg. It is an admission-based organization managed by volunteers and supported by sponsors such as Blood Centers of America, who do not influence our agenda or outcomes. We have a faculty that we've handpicked for the season. This will roll out annually. Their job is to help us decide on topics, define and refine our execution, and participate in each session and provide a consistent presence. And today, Carol Houts and Luigi are our faculty representatives. And each session will then also have 2 to 4 guests with particular expertise on the session topics. And then finally, we're currently building out an advisory board as well to provide input, feedback, and guidance. And that brings us to you, the audience, and we insist you get involved. And hopefully you will see a message from Georgie in the chat on how to do that. Of course, there's the chat here in real time. You can comment, ask questions, pose, but we also want to encourage a high level of post-session engagement as well. So at the end of the day, we're here to think about every possible solution to problems inside and outside the box. And on that note, I'm very happy to hand it over to you, Audrey, to kick off the session.
Thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure to be hosting this inaugural session, and hello to everyone that's joined us. Today, obviously, as we said, we're discussing the delivery of cell and gene therapies in community healthcare settings. I'm blessed to live in Philadelphia, which is proximate to Penn, but that doesn't go for everyone in the world. Despite all of these scientific advances at Penn and other academic institutions and research institutions around the world, our ability to cure is there, but we're failing to distribute these therapies and treatments to patients in need. Only 20% of patients that are eligible get CAR T. And more than 60% who are offered the treatment are declining it. How can that be? You're dying and you're declining treatment. And it's not because the science isn't sound, by the way. It's because the journey is costly, it's complex, you have to travel too far, and overall just too burdensome. And to use oncology, by the way, as an example, over 80% of cancer patients are treated in their community, but only 1% of those community healthcare settings offer cell and gene therapy. So this is an access problem as well as a design problem. And today we're going to ask a provocative question. Are cell and gene therapies designed to remain luxury medicine, or can we actually create the infrastructure, incentives, and partnerships to make them truly accessible and equitable? We're going to talk about this in 3 phases. First, what's blocking it? Second, what's being done to address it? And third, how can each of us play a role to really make a difference? Now, really want to just set the stage here with a survey that we did. So we asked our faculty and experts, how integral do you believe community healthcare is in delivering cell and gene therapies? And you said 60% essential, 33% very important, 5% somewhat important, and 0% said not important. So we all know it's important. 95% of you believe that community healthcare plays a critical role in delivering cell and gene therapies. It's a clear call to action for all of us. If we want to scale, we can't overlook the power of local care networks. So today, as Lee said, we're joined by a group of brilliant voices. Thank you all so much for participating. Their backgrounds are very diverse and represent different perspectives on solutions to this. So let's get into it. And thank you to our faculty members, Carol and Luigi, and guests, Madan, Mike, and Sankalp. But before we launch into the panel discussion, Mike, I would love for you to talk about ARM, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. So just a quick summary on a project that ARM recently executed looking to identify the primary challenges preventing faster penetration and what solutions might be brought to reduce the impact of these barriers. Mike, can you give us a couple minutes on ARM?
Sure, absolutely. So I mean, most of you probably who are listening probably know us, but we're a not-for-profit advocacy group advocating for policies that will advance cell and gene therapies and get these therapies to patients who need them. Our members include industry, developers, and companies supporting those developers, academic centers like UPenn that you mentioned earlier, and also patient organizations. And we have many advocacy initiatives in both rare disease and immuno-oncology, CAR T specifically. But I'll talk a little bit about what we're trying to do to facilitate access of CAR T in the community, solutions to the problems you were talking about. And I think one issue that I'll talk about first, and then maybe we can come to others later, is there has been a regulatory barrier in the labeling that makes it difficult for patients in their communities to access CAR Ts. And it really, one of these things are the REMS requirements in the labels, but also what we call a proximity requirement that indicates that a patient needs to stay in close proximity to the treatment center previously for 28 days. So they have to travel some distance because, again, there aren't typically institutions in everyone's communities that deliver CAR T. So they may have to travel across their state or even to a different state and stay away from home near the treatment center for this period of time, along with a caregiver. And for many people, financially or for other reasons, related to just impact on their day-to-day lives, this just isn't a realistic possibility. So happy to say that just very recently, we got some good news from the agency that for 6 of the commercial CAR T products, they have lifted the REMS requirements. The product from Autolus already did not have REMS requirements. And they have also, for these 6 products, changed the proximity requirement from 28 days to 14 days. This is based on real world data now that we know that most of the adverse events, CRS in particular, presents within the first 14 days. So a positive sign that the agency is being responsive to science and real world data, and it's taking into account the effect that labeling has on patient access. So I think that's a real win for the field and for patients.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mike. So let's get into it. Let's open with a fundamental question. Why are cell and gene therapies not being offered where patients actually receive care? What's getting in the way? Carol, can we start with you from your seat? What are the infrastructure and operational challenges that community centers are facing in deciding whether they should or shouldn't deliver these therapies at their institutions?
Yeah, so we see 4 interlocking hurdles that face the community oncologist and why they're thinking twice about proceeding with a CAR T or autologous gene-modified therapy option. Fit for purpose infrastructure is not in place at most community centers. And these need to be GMP mini factories that are plug and play. They can't undergo big design efforts. They can't undergo big process qualifications, things like that. They need fit for purpose, plug and play infrastructure. And it's not a small cost. It can be $2 to $3 million in 12 months to get something like that up and running. And we do believe there's a point of care model that should be available to community-based centers. But I think that in some states, a regionally placed manufacturing infrastructure is probably the better way to go. And I think the needs of each state and their population is unique state to state. I think we still lack a trained workforce, and it's not just on the manufacturing side. I think a lot of these centers are not clinically ready with the right workforce either. We tend to focus on the manufacturing side. We have to make sure that clinically these centers are ready as well. I think digital chain of identity is still somewhat lacking. Yeah. I think we've got technology coming forward with that, where the manufacturer systems tie to the community EHR. That we've heard concerns by administrators about the liability of handling these drugs. So I think it's important for consideration. And then the cash flow and reimbursement risk is still there. Yeah. So I'd say from our perspective, science is ready. The local operating model can be deployed, but the financial and workforce pieces are still a long ways away.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Madan, I'd love to get your perspective. You worked across both academic and clinical practice environments. What are the commercial, cultural, and financial solutions needed to address this resistance? And maybe if you could comment on what Carol said as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Audrey, and thanks to the group. Excellent discussion so far. So just a little bit of a background. I've been a bedside physician. I've directed a cell therapy program at an NCI Comprehensive Cancer Center, and now I'm on the industry side. So I've seen the ecosystem from pretty much an entire thing. I would actually challenge that even in the community, the perceived infrastructure gap is not as much as we think. So think about the patient journey, right? You have an evaluation of the patient, you have apheresis, which requires infrastructure, but which can be outsourced, right?
Yeah.
The courier picks up the cell product, goes to pharma, engineered, comes back cryopreserved, which means at the treatment center, what you need is a cryo tank with a backup. You do not need a full cell therapy lab. You essentially need a cell therapy pharmacy. And oncology pharmacies are very sophisticated. They know how to maintain cold chain, right? The next sort of bucket is the perceived operational gap, right? Do you have the right talent? Do you have the right infrastructure? I would argue that any large community hospital in the United States of America, this comment is sort of for the US, but let's say more than 400 beds, which is doing, ventricular assist devices, intra-aortic balloon pumps, ECMO, we should challenge ourselves that they can pull off management of the patient now for 14 days with CRS and neurotoxicity. That institute can be retooled, retrained, and without a huge increment in new human capital, new spend, you should be able to implement a cell therapy program. My belief is that in the US, the lack of access at the community is actually a business problem. Hospital systems have choices to make, whether we sort of invest in the next Da Vinci robot to do 1,000 more prostate surgeries, or do I build a program to infuse 50 patients with a cell therapy product? Where is my ROI the most? So if we can solve the business issue,
yes.
In the US, we have precedents that once the business solution is available, the operational solutions happen. So I think this fundamentally sort of reduces to what is the business answer over here? And if we can convince the C-suites of hospital systems or oncology practice leaders that there is, margin to be realized, they're willing to serve the patients. So that's at least sort of my kind of bird's eye view of the problem.
That's great. I love that. Luigi, given your perspective on translating gene therapy to real world settings, what are the healthcare safety roadblocks, if any, to expanding outside the centers of excellence?
Well, thank you for inviting me to discuss here. Of course, I think we have to realize that the challenges that this treatment pose beyond, of course, the practical administration. I mean, they really are a completely different approach to treat a patient. They entail genetic manipulation, cell manipulation, complexity of the treatment, which extend in terms of both the beneficial and potential adverse effect well beyond the administration. I think we have to realize that people are not fully confident or educated about that. Certainly not trained. Oncologists are not trained for that, except for the very young people now. And the familiarity with those treatments will be an important aspect, to essentially bring the patient into that perspective. You have to cross a conventional boundary. Solid oncologists dealing with solid tumors are not familiar with what are essential hematological procedures, like infusion of cell, transplantation, conditioning. This is something which has to be worked on, and I think it's an important. And also in general, there is this risk assessment which is complex. Genetic manipulation linked to potential cancer emergence, which is keep coming back, and we have a very limited evidence of that risk in the real world testing of this treatment. Yet this is still a very important issue, which may constraining also some people which are not fully familiar with. So I think it's a general problem of education from the whole healthcare setting and become more familiar with. Besides, of course, what has been said before, that I can fully underline.
Very interesting. So it's definitely about training and certainly alignment, infrastructure, trust, readiness. Let's talk about now just shifting to what's currently being done. And we've seen progress, like, for example, Medical College of Wisconsin's local delivery model. Caring Cross is doing things, cost-cutting approach and developing centers of excellence. And then also there's a hub and spoke model, which we talked a little bit about. And then there's Children's National decentralization. But is all of this enough? It doesn't seem to be so. Mike, from your perspective and an arm's view, what is the current state of the industry-wide support for this community healthcare in terms of education, like we've talked about, infrastructure reimbursement, certainly reimbursement's a huge part, and then commercial support. And just coupled with that, are we really seeing enough movement toward accessibility, or is it going in the opposite direction?
I think it's going in the right direction, but we have a lot of work to do. I agree with what Madan said, that at least speaking about, community access to commercial CAR T therapies in the US, it is largely a business issue. And a lot of that relates to the ability of some of these institutions to get reimbursed. Because you mentioned cash flow earlier, and they can't afford to treat even a small number of patients if they're not going to be reimbursed. And I think one of the barriers to that right now, and a solution that is being worked on, is some private insurers will not reimburse for CAR T therapies unless the institution has FACT accreditation.
Right.
And I think FACT has rightfully recognized that this is an issue, and they've started an effort to produce a fit for purpose standard. It's not a lighter standard or a lower bar, but it is a fit for purpose standard for communities. And they've pulled together some large community oncology centers, but also, ACCC is part of the effort, of several academic centers, and I'm privileged to be able to participate in that working group as well, and looking to the target, the challenge is to come out with some type of workable version of the standard that can be used in a pilot program later on this year. So I think that's a big part of what we're looking to do to improve community access as well. And
well, thank you for all you're doing. And sorry, I interrupted. What was the
Sure.
last thing?
Yeah, and I don't want to talk for too long. I want to let others speak, but we can talk about the manufacturing aspects as well, and distributed models versus centralized. It's sort of another discussion. Again, in the U.S., I don't think that comes down to cost. It's more about my opinion is there are certain indications, both in oncology and in rare disease, that where there are no viable commercial business cases and developers aren't pursuing those products. And to me, that's where a distributed model or a point of care model, I think, has higher potential, and perhaps is the best route to get treatments to patients.
Very interesting. Carol, just back to you for a minute. What are you seeing in terms of operational models that payers are willing to engage that will lower these barriers to entry for the CGT community sites?
So whether we're talking about a US Medicaid plan, or as this team knows, we're doing some work in Saudi Arabia and Brazil in a partnership with Caring Cross. The purchasing question always seems to be the same. How do we predict cost, quality, and outcomes? If we move CGT production closer to the patients, we see two models that are gaining traction in our collaboration with Caring Cross. Their work in Brazil and the King Faisal Hospital show that there's some real strong potential in this model. Provider as a manufacturer carve out. I do think that we already today have US states that have reimbursement for hospital compounded chemo. So are there some options there? Saudi and Brazil are seeing this as an ability to lower costs for them. And for King Faisal, they've looked at the cost for bringing it down from $350K US to $70,000 per patient, and limiting the amount of time, 14 days, instead of much longer time frame today. Fiocruz also expects 60 to 70% cost reduction for Brazil. We're also seeing, a hospital exemption being a significant thing in Europe, and there is a mechanism in the US under emergency use or compassionate use. You hit on it very well, Mike, on the Medicaid and ultra rare. I think some of those populations, that might be the only way to get them access. And so these are some of the areas where we're working today and really hope to see the needle move.
Very interesting. Thank you for that perspective. And I love the global points. Sankalp, you've been so patient. From a commercial strategy standpoint, are companies actively investing in the commercial adaptations needed to support this new modality in the community healthcare settings or not?
There's a lot of thinking going on this topic. Expansion to the community is priority number 1, 2, and 3 across all the organizations in this space that I've been working with. And I think it's helpful to maybe first just break down what we mean by community, and there's some chatter on the side here. But there's obviously the COEs and where cell therapy is today. There's the community hospitals, which have a lot of the infrastructure that can be organized in the benefit of cell therapy. And then there's the community clinic networks, where in the US, where there's a large majority of the patients that are getting treatment for hematology malignancies today, but not where CAR-T is predominantly. And I think where a lot of the efforts have gone has been in bringing a lot of the community hospitals infrastructure up to scale. But if you look at the sort of the diminishing returns, we're kind of at that point there. If you look at where patients are managed and treated, there's still a lot of hospitals that don't have access to CAR-T, but how many patients they're still treating and managing from a hematology perspective is not that large. But what we need to solve for is the community clinic and the networks, especially within the US. There has been some action there, right? Like Kite has talked about it. I think BMS has talked about it too, with Tennessee Oncology and Virginia Oncology. I think these have been good, successful sort of pilot inroads into this. The question is, how do you scale from here? And I think the idea or the solution here might be in bringing the two segments together. So the community hospitals and the community networks together, in the sense that where you can, instead of envisioning the journey today, which is all inclusive within the four walls of an institution, we can break this journey and bring a collaboration within the ecosystem here, where parts of that journey is cared for within the clinic networks, and part of that journey gets taken care of within these micro hospitals or community hospitals that can support a lot of that inpatient requirements to ease that burden. Now, to enable a lot of that, though, you're going to need a few things. You obviously need the payers supporting this kind of multiple episodes of care, but you also need, to Madan's point in the chat, you need an ecosystem to support this. Like, there's going to be contracting. How are you going to split revenue across different sites of care? How are you going to provide patients that navigation of the care and care journey across multiple sites? And so there's a lot of work to be done, and I think there's opportunity here in the ecosystem for the entrepreneurs that are listening to the webinar, in thinking about these accelerators that can bring more of this community clinic and hospitals together in a alliance.
Yeah. Madan, what's your perspective on, should we assume that what works in the centers of excellence must be replicated in community healthcare, or do we need to differentiate the operational and commercial models to support it?
It's a great question. So let's zoom out. What's a definition of center of excellence?
Right.
It is a volume-based definition, right? It's not necessarily a quality-based definition today in the US, right? So I think what you need to do is think about, as I said, right, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You need to look at a community program, look at the county level, look at the primary, secondary catchment area, look at the SEER database, and say, how many cell therapy patients should this catchment area produce? What are they actually referring to an academic center? And we've done this exercise several times, and there is a big gap. Like, as you mentioned, Audrey, and as a physician, I call it a ventilation perfusion mismatch. There's demand, there's no access. Like, that's how you get lung emboli, right? It's a ventilation perfusion mismatch. So we I think all accept that. And then you need to convince the hospital systems that for an investment of X, your ROI is Y, and Y is significantly higher than X, right? And then you distill down what that operational gap is. And sort of fundamentally, I break it down into bricks and mortar, tools and talents, and processes and workflows. And I can guarantee you, most hospitals have the bricks and mortar. In order to treat 40, 50 patients a year, you probably need 5 chemo chairs and 2 to 3 beds. That's it. And most hospitals have that spare capacity in this system. Talent, yes, needs to be acquired, but it's not that heavy a lift. The heaviest lift, as Luigi mentioned, is training, awareness, processes, workflows. What connects to what? Because it's a very different model. And I think, let me just sort of spell this out. You have to treat the cell therapy as a drug. You have to order it to be collected. You have to order it to be dispensed back into the patient. So you got to create all of these fundamental order sets. And there are programs in the country that have done that very successfully. If you look at the Sarah Cannon HCA network, right? It's a community oncology network. Yes, they are sort of almost equivalent to an academic sort of enterprise in terms of their, research output, et cetera. But they've done that across the country. They're probably the largest consumer of CAR T cells in the United States. The VA program has actually fundamentally solved this. There's one VA program in the country that does cell therapy, and they cater to patients from across the country. So here we are thinking about how a hub and spoke model will evolve. But what I'm saying is it has actually already evolved. And the reason they've evolved is they've figured out the business piece of it. So coming back to my original theme, if you can figure out the business piece, there is always a way forward. But again, one size will not fit all. So what works for, a community cancer center in, a city of 5 million population is not going to work for what's 1 million population, because a center that is going to project to do 60 infusions versus 30 infusions will have different risk tolerances. And that's what needs to be really customized at the end of the day.
Right. That all excellent points. And we see it working in these isolated examples that you cite. But the recipe, perhaps it's not the same, right? And that's the problem. But I guess the question is the recipe being followed at scale? But it could be different, as you're saying, at a smaller scale, larger scale. So let's explore what would it take, I guess, to make this scalable to the extent there is demand for the scalability in the community setting. Practically speaking, if we had, let's say, a blank check or a mandate, what infrastructure or policy would we build? Sankalp, let's start with you. What would a sustainable direct-to-consumer or perhaps a hub and spoke model look like? And can you give us a real-world example of a scenario like that?
I think it's interesting you use the word direct to consumer, right? It's different from the hub and spoke model, but worth talking about for a couple of minutes. And I think it's maybe if we think outside of cell and gene and outside of hematology for a second, and we look at what Lilly has done with Lilly Direct in neuro, where patients can get high quality evaluation of care, and they can go from evaluation to management of care to delivery of products, and so there's a whole journey that can follow. I think if we look at the problems for CAR T, in addition to moving CAR T to the delivery, there is also a problem that we have to acknowledge of moving patients for evaluation and care from the community to the treatment center. And I think both of those things have to work in tandem. And I think this is where we can bring some of those direct to patient care model that have been enabled through the innovations in telehealth that started a lot with COVID, but many have since sustained and scaled. Where can we create an alternate pathways for these patients to be rigorously evaluated for their eligibility for CAR T? You've progressed and you're suffering, and you can, if there was an option for you to meet with a CAR T certified hematologist virtually and get evaluated for cell therapy, why wouldn't you want to do that? In oncology, I think there's ASH publications on this and ASCO publications that many patients frequently get second opinions. And I think there's an opportunity here to have a scalable model for patients that are relapsing, that are refractory, to get that second opinion virtually, get evaluated for care, and plug that in with the care navigation to allow them to obviously get then to the CAR T center. Even despite referrals from community hematologists, oncologists, there's a lot of drop-offs that happen because of all the reasons we discussed, and REMS is going to help reduce that, but they're not going to go away. And so I think you can club this kind of a rigorous evaluation with care navigation to bring that connectivity of the patients directly into the treatment center, obviously all doing it in a way that's in consultation with the primary hematology oncologist that's managing the patients. But I think there's some room here for us to think differently and outside of the, hey, how do we bring CAR T? There is that business model problem. It's been figured out in the treatment center. It still needs to be figured out in the community. So why don't we take the benefit of where it has been figured out and at least scale in that setting?
Yeah, best practice. Luigi, how can scientific and medical communities better collaborate with delivery networks to embed gene therapy platforms into distributed delivery? I know it's a different perspective perhaps than in cell therapy, but I'd love to get your take.
Yes, that's a good point. I think also it's important to look at that side on the industry side. I still wonder whether there will be the capacity to deal with a truly expanded demand. I think that some of the CAR T manufacturing still reflect what has been done mostly on the bench side a few years ago. There could be more, I think, development in terms of scaling up and improving production. It has mentioned shortening the protocol of CAR T generation. This can be shortened as much as a couple of days or even shorter, apparently. That seems to be a very important way forward. I haven't seen yet that level of improvement on vector production. My impression that still rely on transient transfection, which is not fully scalable to very large volume. So I think there's some transition to a model in which would have economy of scale and better capacity, streamlining the process. That will certainly help on the supply side. I think it has mentioned the hospital exemption in Europe. Hospital exemption, I think, mostly happens to deal with that issue of when there is not enough supply, honestly. I don't think it should play as a competitive role with industry, in producing a product which will be less, qualified, probably. I think it's an important space for innovation to help, bringing innovation into the field, which less, lower bar in terms of the requirement for manufacturing. But I think it is a different route, which is mostly to deal with rare diseases, right? But I think the CAR T is where the whole system should find a proper way of working, business driven, and there's still space for. But it's still, I think, there still need to be growing capacity and better, I think, streamlining the process, also on the supply side.
Yeah, very well said. We need to figure out the scale up issue, or perhaps even micro scale down issue, as we've seen in recent examples. So thanks for that perspective. Madan, I see you have your hand up, but I also have a question for you, which is, what's the minimum infrastructure needed, do you think, talking about macro and micro production, to safely and effectively deliver cell and gene therapies in the community setting?
That's a great question. So let me answer that first, and I want to pull on a thread that Sankalpa had mentioned earlier. So I think what you need is complete comprehensive evaluation of the patient upfront, which can be done by a well-trained hematologist, supported by a nurse practitioner, with some supervision from somebody who's already an expert in that. And that bridge can be a telemedicine bridge. Right? And they can figure out sort of what are the financial revenue sharing model, very similar to what Sankalp was saying. Can you have a CAR T physician virtually? At the end of the day, most of this evaluation today in the clinic is quantitative, it's binary, it's based on labs, it's based on imaging. Yes, there is a lot of nuances and subjectivity to assess comorbidities. So yes, you need to lay hands on the patient for sure, but it can be done in a semi sort of a virtual environment. So that's piece one. Apheresis, think about it this way. Most large community cancer hospitals have dialysis. Dialysis nurse skill set and an apheresis skill nurse set is overlapping. They can be cross-trained. What you need at the site are 2 apheresis machines, one always for backup. It's kind of the minimum sort of redundancy rule that you apply. Lymphodepletion. We have hyped up lymphodepletion more than what it needs to be. Lymphodepletion is fludarabine and cyclophosphamide. These drugs have been given to CLL patients before the advent of the rituximabs 25 years ago. As oncologists, we have been giving Flu/Cy for ages. So it's not that complicated. The risk period really starts from infusion of cells to the first 14 days. And again, going back to what Michael mentioned, that's why the agency has said those 14 days, you need to be proximal to the treatment center. That's the highest risk period. And you need the right training for CRS and neurotoxicity. Now, thankfully, with the era of BiTE therapy, these toxicities have already been seen in the community. They're already getting experts at managing this. Yes, there are nuances. There are differences between neurotox of BiTEs and neurotox of CAR-T, but you have to, train these physicians and nurse practitioners and PharmDs, which can be done. So that's probably the heaviest lift over there. And then, coming back to, if you have to have this model of collaboration between community and the academic centers, the places where you need to pay the most attention to are what I call the stickiness places, where the handoffs happen. Okay. Our healthcare system is notorious for doing bad job at handoffs. So the evaluation in collaboration, the patient sort of getting maybe lymphodepletion in the community, coming to the treatment center and handing it back to the community. Those are the areas where we need to really pay attention to. And underneath all of this is a business transaction at each of these points, right? It's back to the business. We have to sort of solve that. I'm fairly confident in saying that the new investment for tools, talent, bricks, mortar should not be more than low single-digit $1 million for a program to get standing. And then the program has to map out what their ROI is, given what their catchment area is and how much volume they need to generate. Going back to Sankalp's point of a direct-to-consumer, what I would challenge is that the academic centers do a micro model of that today. Most academic centers have networks, they have satellite clinics, they already have some loose affiliation partnership with community hospital. Get that field started. And if they need help, reach out to the appropriate people. There are many consultants, organizations within the country that are able to solve this piecemeal. What would really be nice is, quote unquote, if you had an Uber service that could do a one size fits all or multiple size fits multiple people solution, so that the academic center doesn't have to go shopping to 10 people, 10 consultants to patch and paint things together. To me, that's the piece that is fundamentally missing in the country today, is that you don't have a one-stop shop for an academic center to go to and say, solve this for me, A to Z.
Right. Well said. Mike, I'd be curious to hear regulatory perspective here. Is there room for regulatory accreditation, standardization, and or, by the way, financial innovation here? And what policies would help tip the scales toward more highly distributed delivery?
Yeah, so I think, turning to reimbursement first, and Baden has already talked about this, I think, and others, but the problem right now is that if you're going to distribute care and, have the patient be evaluated in one place, apheresis in another, perhaps lymphodepleted somewhere else and treated at another site, everyone has to be able to be paid for the work that they're doing, right? And right now reimbursement is based on a DRG, so it's based on a case. So that we need some innovation there, which it sounds like it's already happening. But I think there won't be a one size fits all approach for that. On the regulatory front, I think some additional barriers that remain in the United States is the long-term follow-up requirement, which, as someone pointed out earlier, was not addressed in the recent labeling change. And I think there are some data for at least some of the products to support a reduction in that time. But also, I think we need more creative ways of making it easier for patients to comply with long-term follow-up. And perhaps some of this can be done virtually. And I think there were some questions, about care centers in the community, things that Walmart and CVS are doing, for example. I think they may have a role here to play in facilitating long-term follow-up for these therapies as well. And I know, some of those groups are looking at ways of doing that right now.
Well, I feel very encouraged by that. Sorry, you're going to say something else.
Yeah. As far as like, accreditation of institutions, again, FACT is working on this community accreditation. I think there may not be a one size fits all solution there. I think there's room for a variety of different types of voluntary standards. I do think that they should be voluntary. And I think that, one thing we need to address is, when payers are sort of arbitrarily selecting one particular accreditation or another as an absolute requirement to reimburse, that can be that can definitely be a barrier for these centers to be able to treat patients.
Wow. Well, we shared a lot of great ideas and methods that are being used now, and certainly appreciate all the work that you're all doing to advance this field. And it does sound solvable, but it will definitely require shared infrastructure, new economic models for sure, and eco-wide system, economic, everyone working together to make this happen. Let's just say that. So let's now move to audience Q&A. I know there was a lot of questions submitted in through the chat, so we'll check that out. Let me see, going to Q&A number 1. So it looks like Raphael, a good friend, who will cover the cost? It seems like somebody already answered, Sancal, but maybe you want to address it live. Who will cover the cost of training hospitals, building proper capabilities? Likely the patient at the end is his point, which means 60% of the patients declining cell therapy will stay high or even higher. So I see you answered it in chat, but maybe you just want to speak to it quickly.
Look, ultimately, the providers that are hospitals and community that's setting up this infrastructure has to shoulder some of that. But I think what comes in the way here are a few things. I think there's a lot to figure out. You're a practice, you're a hospital, and you've got all the things you got going on, and to take time away to focus on cell therapy to maybe treat 5 patients initially, that's a big, it's a big investment of time and effort. But what can be done here is to lower the cost and burden. If there is a third party here that can serve the community broadly in the training, the education, the working with the payers, the certification, then you're, number one, you're lowering the cost of a provider to do it. 2, you're reducing that burden because you've outsourced some of that problem away to a third party, at least partially. And 2, you're bringing scalability. It doesn't have to be every community practice having to figure this out, and that's really hard. The big ones, sophisticated, they can do it. It's a reputation thing. They want to do it. They're going to invest the time in it. But there's a big long tail, and that's where I think having a third party here, there is a business model here to be realized for the venture, the people in the venture world.
Yeah, interesting. Any other comments on that? Otherwise, we can go to the next question. All right. Raphael asked another great question, and he's also a member of our faculty, so that's great. Follow-on question: what is the process and who covers the cost, apheresis, hospitalization costs, in the case of manufacturing failure, making cells unable to be given back to patients? Anyone want, Mandan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, let me take a crack at that, and others feel free to chime in. My understanding is that the cost of the product does not have to be borne by the treatment center or the payer until the product is in spec and has been infused. Just that's broadly speaking, different commercial CAR T manufacturers may have sort of different nuances. If you do an apheresis and the product never makes it back, my understanding is the apheresis is still a billable service. So I don't think it's a sunk cost for the treatment center. And even when you look at commercial payers, although we say it's a single case agreement, most commercial payers do it in what they call bundles or zones. So evaluation is a zone, evaluation is paid separately, apheresis is paid separately. And typically the big bundle starts from either start of lymphodepletion or 1 day before the infusion of the product. That's how most commercial payers, at least what I've seen, have sort of structured it. So there's this myth, we use this word single case agreement as if everything from the patient arriving to the treatment center until day 30 is all one bundle. That's typically not how it is structured. And just so that we clarify on DRG versus single case, the word DRG is used when the product is infused inpatient. DRG is not an outpatient terminology. So if you infuse something outpatient, that is a fee for service and is negotiated as per your contracts with your various payers. So if a community center wants to do outpatient CAR T, they can absolutely do it. They don't avail of the DRG. If a center, for a variety of reasons, wants to do inpatient CAR T, or if the patient has comorbidities, that's when the DRG sort of concept kicks in.
Okay.
I'll add that I think patients in most cases would be coded then as a clinical trial patient in those applications if you're still administering the product. Let's say it's out of spec, and in which case then some of the services that were rendered can be adequately supported by the manufacturer.
Absolutely. To Sankalp's point. Yes, just to Sankalp's point, when you administer an out-of-spec product, it has to be administered under some sort of a clinical trial protocol. Often the word expanded access protocol, compassionate protocols are the terminologies that are used, but it comes under an IRB-approved protocol, and the reimbursement is per the rules of a clinical trial protocol.
Got it. Mike, it looks like you wanted to comment here as well.
Actually, I had a follow-up question for Madi.
Okay.
So you talked about the example of a CAR T and apheresis being reimbursed in the context of a failed manufacturing lot. What about like TILs, where there's a surgical procedure involved in collecting the material? Is that similar? Too early to say, or what kind of insights?
I think from my standpoint, obviously Amtagvi, the Iovance product, is FDA approved. I don't know how they have sort of solved for that. Again, we don't, to the best of my knowledge, there is no clear quote unquote CPT code for tumor harvest for TIL manufacturing. So I'm sure there is a solution that is out there today. I'm just not aware about what exactly that solution is. I should mention that for Medicare, the apheresis cost is embedded in the DRG. So there is not a separate apheresis bill that can be dropped. It is part of the DRG 18 bundle that Medicare does not pay separately for apheresis. They don't believe in paying separately for procurement of the cells in general.
Got it. So we do have time for, I think we have a minute for the last question here. Navneet Manchal asks, cash flow issues were mentioned earlier in the conversation. I don't think we actually talked about this. We talked about reimbursement issues generally, but not the timing issue, which is he bringing up. And I don't know if anyone has a solution to this other than potentially selling your receivables. But he says, you pay for the product, but the revenue cycle for reimbursement can take some time. Can the panel comment on potential solutions for this issue? So this is the timing between outlay and reimbursement. Does anyone have some I know that some people actually sell those receivables, but other than that, I don't know if there's any potential other solutions.
I mean, this is where in the order to cash, this is where the third-party logistics organizations are serving as an intermediary to give that kind of a cushion, right? So they can be a 90-day policy as agreed by the manufacturer to give that much cushion. Now, Medicare reimbursement could end up taking much longer time, and in which case it can still be a cash flow burden. But I think these are things with sufficient vocalization and noise being made. These can be services that manufacturers can offer through the existing setups that we have within the ecosystem. So I feel like that should be very solvable, even if that is a crunch for some of these community providers.
Okay, Lee, can you help us land this plane and translate maybe a summary of today's conversation into action? Because that's what we like to see here, is what we can all do to make a difference. So let me hand it over to you to summarize. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Audrey, and just a phenomenal conversation. I think, one of the major takeaways is this going to be a topic which we will revisit with some frequency, obviously because it's super important and critical to almost everything else, related to the field. There are some huge regional disparities, which we haven't even touched on here in a large part, which is understandable. And also because things are moving super quickly, right? As we saw with the, elimination of REMS and the reduction of proximity requirements recently. So there's a bunch of takeaways here, many of which I won't be able to cover, but I think, for me listening to this conversation, which is super informative, I think obviously we need to think about community healthcare, perhaps not as a single bucket, but several discrete buckets. That's certainly one of the takeaways that I understood here, and that the solutions for one bucket don't necessarily translate to another. And that's even before we account for regional disparities. I think that there's also a thread here, around this idea that in the community setting, you won't have necessarily all on-site or in-site solutions, and that it may require a collaboration between a number of organizations to provide the service necessary in that community. And one of the keys to unlocking the ability to do that is going to be breaking the payment bundling, right? And so to allow in instances where it's required, the payment of apheresis, separate from lymphodepletion, separate from infusion, separate from patient follow-up. And I think here, there is existing infrastructure in these communities, whether it's blood centers, it's specialty pharma, it's healthcare distributors, in concert with the hospitals and the community clinics that might be critical to that. Obviously, still a lot of pricing reimbursement things. I think, very encouraged by Mike's report of ARM and stakeholders working with FACT to try and pivot the accreditation model and allow insurers to be more liberal in the reimbursement at different kinds of clinical sites. I think that's going to be super critical. And aligning the financial incentives. I mean, I think this Madan's point and Solcom's point too, to a certain extent, on this, that this is largely, at least in the US, and I think it's true to some extent, although different in other regions, a business problem more or just as much as an operational one is a critical thing to look at and a critical thing to address. I heard, a lot of talk and be curious to really try and solutionize around the gaps, right? There was this thread of we don't do well transitioning from one healthcare bucket to another, is the same kind of comment as if everything can't be done in one hospital and does require multiple stakeholders, how do we set that up from a business perspective, from a legal agreement perspective, and from a financial reimbursement perspective? So I think, there's certainly an ARM and FACT call to action here. I think that there is a call to action amongst the stakeholders that exist in the communities that might be critical to community healthcare to work together, whether that's apheresis, community clinics, specialty pharma. There was some super interesting commentary in the chat about that. I think that's a call to action. I think there's a call to action. We didn't touch on it more, but there was a brief glimpse of, at the very beginning, Madan mentioned the need for the on-site pharmacy. And we've certainly heard of pharmacies being terribly resistant to handling these therapies. And sometimes it's tied to the cash flow or reimbursement issues. But I think conference organizers, professional organizations need to find a better way to bring the pharmacy community into this conversation, because I haven't met very many pharmacists in the conferences I go to, and I think that's a dialogue we would be well served to grease a little bit more. And then the final call to action, I think that I picked up on, and that this was a common thread, is education of the community oncologists. And how do we do that? We cannot rely on biopharma alone to educate. And so somehow we need to do a better job with the ASHs, as those professional organizations in this sector, to try and figure out how to bring better and timely resources. Because I think, this is a sector that's moved very quickly, and there's a lot of misconceptions about what CAR Ts look like today based on what CAR Ts looked like 2-3 years ago, which is, a lifetime away from what they look like today.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you to all of our panelists, faculty, audience members, and sponsor BCA Advanced Therapies Network, without whom none of this would be possible. And today is just the beginning. This is not a panel or a podcast. For those of you that know, this is a platform for discussion, and solutions are needed to increase accessibility and affordability of cell and gene therapies. This topic will likely continue to revisit, as this is vital to the treatment paradigm. Our industry has the science, and what we need now is the system, and that requires bold thinking, collective action, and relentless advocacy. Thank you, ARM. If you want to stay ahead of future sessions of AT3, make sure you head to advancedtherapiesthinktank.com, subscribe, follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be launching our next session very soon, and we look forward to building the next episode of this think tank with you. Until then, stay disruptive, stay engaged, and let's get CGTs where they belong, everywhere patients need them. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey.
Happy 4th, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy 4th of July for those celebrating. Have a great weekend. See some fireworks and keep all your fingers.